The smell of garlic and fresh-baked bread filled the air at La Melodia as Ming walked between the tables, expertly balancing 3 plates of steaming pasta on her forearm. She'd gotten pretty good at this balancing act over the past 3 years. The fancy Italian restaurant was always packed, especially during dinner hours when the sound of piano music floated through the air, mixing with the quiet chatter of guests and the gentle clink of wine glasses. What none of the guests knew, not the businessmen in their expensive suits, or the couples celebrating their anniversaries, or even her fellow waiters, was that Ming could play every single piece the restaurant's pianist performed, and then some. She'd spent 15 years of her life practicing piano, dreaming of performing on big stages. But life had other plans. "Table 7 needs their check," called out her coworker from across the room. Ming nodded, quickly dropping off the pasta dishes before pulling out her notepad. As she walked through the restaurant, her steps unconsciously fell in time with the melody coming from the grand piano in the corner. Tonight, Mr. Li was playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and Ming could feel her fingers twitching slightly, muscle memory kicking in as they remembered the notes. She'd given up her music school dreams when her mom got sick 3 years ago. The choice had been simple, really. Her mom needed help with medical bills, and waiting tables paid better than any entry-level music job she could find. Besides, she could still play on her old upright piano at home, even if the keys were a bit yellowed and some of them stuck sometimes. "Beautiful music, isn't it?" An elderly guest commented as Ming handed him his check. "Makes the food taste even better." Ming smiled warmly, remembering how her piano teacher used to say that music was like seasoning for the soul. She'd been just 6 years old when her parents saved up to buy that old upright piano, having noticed how their daughter would spend hours tapping out tunes on a toy keyboard. Back in the kitchen, Ming quickly loaded her tray with fresh water glasses, her mind wandering to the upcoming busy weekend. The restaurant had some VIP reservations coming up, and everyone was a bit on edge. The manager had been reminding them all week about maintaining the highest standards. Ming wasn't worried, though. She'd learned to stay calm under pressure, just like she used to before piano recitals. As she worked, she hummed quietly along with the piano music, remembering the countless hours she'd spent practicing these same pieces. Her old piano teacher, Mrs. Wu, would always tell her she had a special gift, not just for playing the notes, but for making people feel something when she played. Ming sometimes wondered what Mrs. Wu would think if she could see her now, serving pasta instead of performing concerts. The evening continued its usual rhythm: take orders, serve food, clear tables, repeat. But every now and then, Ming would pause near the piano, letting the music wash over her. Some nights, like tonight, she'd close her eyes for just a moment and imagine herself sitting on that bench, her fingers dancing across the keys. The dreams were still there, tucked away safely like sheet music in a drawer, waiting for the right moment. Little did Ming know that very soon, fate would give her an unexpected chance to dust off those dreams and share her gift with the world. But for now, she just smiled, picked up another tray of drinks, and continued her dance between the tables, her feet moving to the rhythm of a life she'd learned to embrace, even if it wasn't the one she'd originally planned. Saturday nights at La Melodia were always special, but this particular evening felt different somehow. The restaurant was packed to the brim, with every table filled and a waiting list that stretched into next week. Ming could feel the buzz in the air as she rushed between tables, her practiced smile never faltering despite the hectic pace. Mr. Li sat at his usual spot at the grand piano, his fingers moving gracefully across the keys as he played a lively piece that made the whole restaurant feel alive. Ming had just finished serving a plate of seafood risotto when she noticed something wasn't quite right. The music had suddenly stopped mid-phrase, something Mr. Li never did. She turned around just in time to see Mr. Li hunched over the keys, his face twisted in pain. His right hand was clutched against his chest, and his breathing seemed labored. The abrupt silence drew everyone's attention, and for a moment, the entire restaurant froze. "Someone call an ambulance." Ming's voice cut through the stunned silence as she rushed to Mr. Lee's side. Her first aid training from college kicked in as she helped him away from the piano bench and onto a nearby chair. The restaurant's manager, Mr. Chen, was already on the phone with emergency services, his usually calm voice tinged with worry. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The paramedics arrived quickly, their efficient movements and quiet professionalism helping to keep everyone calm. As they wheeled Mr. Lee out on a stretcher, he managed a weak smile and whispered something about missing his evening performance. Ming felt her heart squeeze. It was so typical of him to think about the music even now. After the ambulance left, reality started setting in. The restaurant was still full of guests, many of whom had come specifically for the combination of fine dining and live music that made La Melodia famous. Mr. Chen paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, a sure sign he was stressed. "The Yamamoto family is coming in less than an hour," he muttered, checking his phone for the 100th time. "They're bringing potential investors. The music is part of what makes this place special." Ming overheard him talking to the other managers, their voices heavy with concern. The Yamamotos were regular customers who had helped spread the word about La Melodia among their high-profile business circles. The other servers tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but Ming could see the worry on their faces. Without the piano music, the clinking of cutlery seemed too loud, the conversations too stark. It was like the heart of the restaurant had suddenly stopped beating. Ming kept working, her mind racing. She'd seen the sheet music Mr. Lee used, classic pieces that she knew by heart. The same pieces she practiced thousands of times in her tiny apartment, playing late into the night on her old upright piano. Her fingers twitched involuntarily as she cleared a table, muscle memory taking over as she imagined playing the pieces herself. She watched as Mr. Chen made frantic phone calls, trying to find a last-minute replacement pianist, but she knew it was hopeless. Finding someone qualified on such short notice, especially on a Saturday night, was nearly impossible. The restaurant's reputation was at stake, and with it, potentially everyone's jobs. Ming's heart pounded as she stood by the kitchen doors, looking at the empty piano bench. The same bench she dreamed of sitting on so many times before. She took a deep breath, remembering her mother's words. "Sometimes life gives you a chance when you least expect it." With trembling hands but determined steps, she began walking toward Mr. Chen's office, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything. Ming's footsteps felt heavier with each step toward Mr. Chen's office. The familiar sounds of the kitchen, the sizzling pans, the calls of "order up," the clinking of plates, seemed distant now, muffled by the pounding of her heart in her ears. She'd walked this path hundreds of times before, but never with such purpose, never with such fear mixing with hope in her stomach. She paused outside his office, watching through the glass as Mr. Chen ran his hands through his hair again, phone pressed to his ear. "No, I understand. Yes, thank you anyway." He set the phone down with a heavy sigh. Through the door, Ming could hear him muttering, "Fourth pianist to turn me down. What am I going to do?" Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door. It was strange. She performed complex piano pieces in front of hundreds of people during her school days. But somehow, this simple knock felt more terrifying than any recital she'd ever given. "Come in," Mr. Chen called out, his voice tired. Ming stepped inside, clutching her order pad like a shield. The small office was cramped with filing cabinets and awards the restaurant had won over the years. A framed review praised La Melodia's perfect blend of cuisine and classical music. "Mr. Chen," Ming started, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I think I might be able to help with the piano situation." The words came out in a rush, like water breaking through a dam. He looked up, confusion clear on his face. "The piano situation? Ming, unless you know a professional pianist who can be here in." He checked his watch. 45 minutes. I don't see how." "I can play," she interrupted, then immediately felt her cheeks flush at her boldness. I mean, I studied piano for 15 years. I know all the pieces Mr. Lee usually plays. I can. You play piano? Mr. Chen's eyebrows shot up, his expression a mix of disbelief and desperate hope. How did I not know this? Why didn't you ever mention it? Ming shifted her weight from one foot to the other. It never seemed relevant to serving tables, she said softly. But I've been playing since I was 6. I had to stop studying when... She paused, swallowing hard. When my mom got sick. But I still practice at home. I know I'm just a waitress, but... Just a waitress. Mr. Chen stood up, his eyes suddenly bright with interest. Ming, right now, you're telling me you might be our miracle. But I need to know, can you really play? This isn't just knowing chopsticks or heart and soul, right? A small smile tugged at Ming's lips. Without saying a word, she pulled out her phone and found a video she'd recorded last month. In it, her fingers flew across her old upright piano's keys, performing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. She handed the phone to Mr. Chen. As he watched, his eyes widened. The office filled with the sound of complex musical phrases and powerful crescendos, even through the phone's tiny speaker. When the video ended, he looked up at Ming as if seeing her for the first time. The Yamamoto family will be here in 30 minutes, he said slowly. They're bringing potential investors who could help us open a second location. Everything needs to be perfect. He paused, studying her face. Are you absolutely sure you can do this? Ming thought about all the nights she'd spent practicing after her shifts, her fingers dancing over silent keys in her mind during quiet moments at work. She thought about her mother, who'd always told her to keep her dreams close, even when life took unexpected turns. She thought about Mr. Lee, who'd filled this restaurant with beautiful music night after night, creating the perfect atmosphere for countless special moments. Yes, she said firmly, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. I can do this. I want to do this. Mr. Chen stood silent for a moment, then nodded. Okay, he said, and that single word carried the weight of trust and opportunity. Go get changed. There's a spare performance outfit in the storage room from when we had a female pianist last year. I hope it fits. As Ming turned to leave, he called after her. Ming? She looked back. Thank you for stepping up. Sometimes the biggest moments in life come when we least expect them. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As she walked toward the storage room, her steps felt lighter, as if she were floating. After 3 years of watching from the sidelines, she was finally going to play that beautiful grand piano. And somehow, surprisingly, she wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. The black dress from the storage room fit surprisingly well, though Ming had to pin the shoulders a bit. As she stood in the employee bathroom, staring at her reflection, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the familiar server's uniform she'd worn for 3 years. Instead, she saw someone who looked like she belonged on a concert stage. Her hands smoothed down the fabric nervously as she remembered her mother's words. Stand tall. Your talent deserves to be seen. The dining room had grown quieter, the absence of piano music making everyone speak in hushed tones. Through the kitchen window, Ming could see the Yamamoto family being led to their regular table. Mrs. Yamamoto was wearing her signature pearl necklace, and beside her walked 2 men in expensive suits, the investors Ming guessed. Her throat felt dry. You okay? Asked Lin, one of the other servers, adjusting Ming's hair slightly. I still can't believe you've been hiding this talent from us all this time. She smiled warmly. Go show them what you can do. Ming took a deep breath and stepped into the dining room. The click of her borrowed dress shoes against the hardwood floor seemed impossibly loud. Conversations paused as she walked past tables, and she could hear whispers of confusion from regular customers who recognized her as their usual server. The grand piano waited for her, its polished surface reflecting the warm lighting of the restaurant. It was bigger than her upright at home, more elegant, more intimidating. Ming approached it the way she'd seen Mr. Li do hundreds of times, from the left side, giving a small bow to the closest tables before taking her seat. The bench felt different from what she was used to. Higher, firmer. She adjusted it slightly, muscle memory from years of practice taking over. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Then she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the air. Ming had chosen this piece carefully. It was gentle enough not to startle the diners, but complex enough to show she wasn't just a casual player. As her fingers found their rhythm, the familiar peace of playing washed over her. She forgot about the watching eyes, forgot about her nerves, forgot about everything except the music. The piece flowed from her hands like water, each note crystal clear in the hushed restaurant. She'd played this song countless times in her tiny apartment, but here, on this magnificent piano, it sounded different. Fuller, richer, more alive. She could feel the mood in the restaurant shifting. Conversations that had stopped in surprise when she first sat down slowly resumed, but quieter now, more appreciative. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mr. Chen showing the Yamamoto family to their table. Mrs. Yamamoto was smiling, nodding her head slightly to the music. As the nocturne came to its gentle end, there was a moment of complete silence, followed by soft but genuine applause from nearby tables. Ming's cheeks flushed, but she didn't pause. She transitioned smoothly into the next piece, a Debussy arrangement that Mr. Li often played during the dinner rush. Her confidence grew with each note. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, and Ming caught the scent of the lemon wedges, the same ones she would have been preparing right now on a normal night. But this wasn't a normal night. Here she was, sitting at the piano she dreamed about for 3 years, finally sharing the music that had lived in her heart all this time. The next hour passed in a blur of music. Ming played piece after piece, each one flowing naturally into the next. She mixed classical favorites with gentle jazz standards, just as Mr. Li used to do. Her fingers remembered every note, every rhythm, every subtle change in tempo. It felt like coming home. What surprised her most was how natural it felt. The same instincts that had helped her navigate a busy dinner service with a full tray of plates now helped her read the room, adjusting her music to match the atmosphere. When the conversations grew livelier, she played more upbeat pieces. When things quieted down, she returned to softer, more contemplative songs. As she began the final bars of a Beethoven sonata, Ming realized something. For the first time in 3 years, she felt completely, truly herself. She wasn't just the reliable waitress anymore. She was the musician she'd always been, finally playing the songs that had waited so patiently in her heart. The magic of Ming's first performance at the piano didn't end when the last note faded away. Instead, it seemed to take on a life of its own. At first, it was just a few phone cameras pointed her way, their small screens glowing in the dimly lit restaurant. Then more appeared, like fireflies lighting up the evening air. A young couple celebrating their anniversary was the first to share a video online. "You won't believe what we just saw," their caption read. "Our waitress turned out to be a piano genius." The clip showed Ming's hands dancing across the keys as she played a particularly challenging section of Mozart. Within hours, the video had thousands of views. The restaurant's regular customers couldn't stop talking about it. "Did you know?" they asked each other. "Did you have any idea she could play like that?" Mrs. Wang, who had been coming to La Melodia every Tuesday for the past 5 years, wiped tears from her eyes after Ming's rendition of a traditional folk song. "Such feeling," she said, patting Ming's hand when she paused between pieces. "You play with your heart, dear." The Yamamoto family's dinner turned out to be a huge success. Mrs. Yamamoto herself approached the piano during a brief pause, her pearl necklace catching the light. Your music reminds me of my grandmother's stories about her favorite concert hall in Tokyo, she said warmly. We'd love to hear you play again. The investors at her table nodded in agreement, their earlier serious expressions replaced by genuine smiles. By midnight, local food bloggers had picked up the story. La Melodia's secret star, one headline read. Another called it, a modern Cinderella story, with piano keys instead of glass slippers. People began calling the restaurant, asking if the waitress would be playing again. The reservation list, already long, grew even longer. Ming's coworkers were her biggest supporters. They'd known her for years as the quiet, reliable server who never missed a shift. Now they saw her in a completely new light. I can't believe we've been working together all this time and I never knew, Lynn exclaimed during their break. All those times you were humming while rolling silverware. You weren't just following along. You were actually playing it in your head, weren't you? The kitchen staff got in on the excitement too. Chef Liu, known for his serious demeanor, admitted that his cooking rhythm had changed with Ming's playing. Different energy, he said with a rare smile. The food and music, they danced together now. More natural. Social media couldn't get enough of the story. Videos of Ming playing were being shared across different platforms, each with thousands of comments. People loved the human element. A talented musician who had set aside her dreams to help her family, now finding her way back to music in such an unexpected way. A local news station sent a reporter to do a small feature. Ming felt strange being interviewed, but she spoke from her heart about her love for music and her gratitude for this second chance. She talked about her mother, who had always encouraged her playing, and about Mr. Li, who was recovering well in the hospital and had sent her a touching message of support. What touched Ming most were the messages from other people sharing similar stories. A dancer who had become a teacher, a painter who worked in an office. All of them understood what it meant to keep their passion alive while life took them in different directions. Your story gives us hope, one comment read. Maybe it's never too late to let our dreams shine. The restaurant's atmosphere had changed too. There was an extra spark of excitement in the air, a sense that something special was happening. Regular customers started requesting their favorite pieces, and Ming found herself learning new songs to add to her repertoire. The piano, which had always been a beautiful part of the restaurant's ambience, now felt like the beating heart of the place. As she played each evening, Ming sometimes caught glimpses of people's reactions. The small child watching her hands with wide-eyed wonder, the elderly couple holding hands as they swayed slightly to a familiar melody, the busy businessman pausing mid-conversation to close his eyes and just listen. These moments reminded her that music wasn't just about the person playing. It was about the connections it created, the emotions it stirred, the memories it awakened. 2 weeks had passed since Ming's first performance at the piano, and La Melodia was busier than ever. The dinner rush was in full swing, the restaurant humming with energy as Ming's music filled the air. She'd just finished a gentle version of a popular movie theme when she noticed an older gentleman sitting alone at a corner table, watching her intently. There was something different about the way he listened. While other customers chatted over their meals, occasionally glancing at the piano, this man was completely focused on the music. His eyes followed her hands, and she could see him slightly nodding at particularly complex passages. Ming felt a flutter of nervousness, but continued playing, moving into a challenging piece she usually saved for quieter moments. The man's eyebrows raised slightly as she began the difficult opening bars of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. She'd practiced this piece countless times in her tiny apartment, apologizing to her neighbors for the late-night rehearsals. Now, on the restaurant's grand piano, the powerful chords resonated through the room, turning heads and drawing all eyes to her corner of the restaurant. During her break, Mr. Chen approached her with an unusually excited expression. "Ming," he said, his voice low but urgent, "do you know who that man is?" When she shook her head, he continued, "That's Professor Zhang, the director of the City Music Conservatory. He's one of the most respected music educators in the country." Ming's heart skipped a beat. The City Music Conservatory was the prestigious school she dreamed of attending years ago, before life had taken her down a different path. She even attended a few of their public concerts, sitting in the back row and imagining what it would be like to study there. "He asked to speak with you," Mr. Chen added, smiling at her shocked expression. "Don't worry about your tables. Lin will cover them. This is important." Walking to Professor Zhang's table felt like moving through a dream. The older man stood up as she approached, offering her a warm smile. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I hope you don't mind, but I've been watching videos of you playing for the past week. Your story has caught quite a bit of attention in our musical community." Ming sat down, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. The professor took a sip of his tea before continuing. "What struck me wasn't just your technical skill, though that's impressive, especially considering you haven't had formal training in years. It's the way you connect with your audience. That's something that can't be taught." He paused, studying her face. "Tell me, have you ever considered returning to your musical studies?" Ming felt her throat tighten. I used to dream about it," she admitted. "But between work and helping my family." She trailed off, not wanting to make excuses. Professor Zhang nodded understanding. "Life often takes us on unexpected detours," he said gently. "But sometimes those detours lead us exactly where we need to be." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out some papers. "We have a special program at the conservatory for working musicians. Classes are scheduled around typical work hours, and," he smiled, "we offer scholarships to exceptional candidates." Ming's eyes widened as she looked at the papers. It was an application for the conservatory's evening program. "But I'm just a waitress who plays piano," she whispered. The professor shook his head. "No, you're a musician who has been waiting tables. There's a difference." He slid the application toward her. "The scholarship would cover most of the tuition. You could keep working here if you want to, though perhaps with a different role now." Tears blurred Ming's vision as she looked at the application. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her talent. She thought about all the nights she'd spent playing her old upright piano, keeping her dreams alive one note at a time. She thought about Mr. Li, who had called from the hospital to tell her how proud he was when he saw the videos of her playing. "Take some time to think about it," Professor Zhang said kindly, standing up. "But not too long. The semester starts in 6 weeks. He paused, then added, "You know, in all my years of teaching, I've learned that talent finds its way to the surface, no matter what. Your journey to the piano may have been unconventional, but perhaps that's exactly what makes it special." As Ming watched him leave, still holding the application in her trembling hands, she realized that sometimes life's most beautiful moments come disguised as ordinary days. She'd walked into work 2 weeks ago as a waitress, and now she was being offered a chance to become the musician she'd always dreamed of being. 6 months had passed since that life-changing night at La Melodia, and everything was different now. The restaurant had become one of the city's hottest spots, with people making reservations weeks in advance just to hear the former waitress play. But more than that, it had become a place where dreams felt possible. Ming now spent her afternoons at the City Music Conservatory, her notebook filled with music theory and composition notes. The evening program turned out to be perfect. She could study during the day and play at the restaurant 3 nights a week. Mr. Chen had officially hired her as La Melodia's main pianist, though she still sometimes picked up a serving tray when they were short-staffed, much to the delight of regular customers. Her old upright piano sat in her apartment, still slightly out of tune, but now covered with sheet music from her classes. Next to it stood a small photo frame showing her and Mr. Li sitting together at the restaurant's grand piano. He had recovered well from his heart scare and now joined her for special duet performances twice a month. "You gave this place a new soul," he told her during one of their rehearsals. The restaurant staff had changed too. Lin, one of the servers, had started taking singing lessons after Ming encouraged her to pursue her own hidden passion. The shy dishwasher turned out to be a talented artist and now displayed his sketches on one of the restaurant's walls. It was as if Ming's story had given everyone permission to dream a little bigger. One busy Friday evening, as Ming played a piece she composed for her music theory class, she noticed a young girl watching her from nearby. The child couldn't have been more than 7, but her eyes followed Ming's hands with intense focus. During a break, the girl's mother approached the piano. "My daughter hasn't stopped talking about you since we saw that video online," she said softly. "She just started piano lessons, but she was getting discouraged. Then she saw your story, and—" the woman smiled. "Well, now she practices without being asked." These moments happened more often than Ming had expected. People would share their own stories, of dreams put aside, of talents hidden, of second chances. Sometimes they'd leave notes with their tips, telling her how her music had touched them, or how her journey had inspired them to take their own leap of faith. The Yamamoto family had become even more regular visitors, often bringing friends from the business world. Their investment had helped La Melodia open a second location across town, where another hidden talent, a former accountant who played violin, now performed nightly. Mr. Chen joked that he should start asking about musical abilities in job interviews. Ming's mother visited the restaurant whenever she could, sitting proudly at a corner table. "I always knew," she would tell anyone who would listen. "Even when she was tiny, playing on that toy keyboard, I knew she had a gift." The years of sacrifice, of long hours and delayed dreams, had finally led to something beautiful. Professor Zhang often stopped by to listen, sometimes bringing other faculty members or students. "See," he would tell them, "music finds its way." He had even asked Ming to speak to some of his classes about her unconventional journey to the conservatory. The restaurant's atmosphere had evolved into something unique, part dining room, part concert hall, part dream incubator. Regular customers now came not just for the food or the music, but for the feeling of possibility that filled the air. They'd point out the piano to first-time visitors and whisper, "Wait until you hear her play. Let me tell you her story." On this particular evening, as Ming finished her last piece, she looked around the familiar room that had changed her life. The warm lighting caught the polished surface of the grand piano, the same one she dreamed of playing for 3 years. The tables were full of people enjoying their meals, their conversations mixing with the lingering notes of her music. As she stood to take her break, she noticed a new server nervously carrying plates to a nearby table. The young woman was humming softly to herself, and Ming smiled, remembering how she used to do the same thing. In this room full of everyday magic, who knew what other dreams were waiting to be discovered? After all, sometimes the most extraordinary stories start with something as simple as a piano, a dining room, and the courage to say yes when opportunity knocks.